Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the last week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke, the Moscow media darling, and David Green, the Illinois congressional candidate. Since we don't know who's watching tonight, why, Ron's brought a new hat.
I'm just having a bad hair day.
Our program's name, News from Neptune, is chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years that we have been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is December 27th, the third day of Xmas, and on this day in 1945, the World Bank International Monetary Fund were created with the signing of an agreement by 29 nations. There was one particular nation who encouraged that agreement. The arrangement worked out in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, an unlikely spot, was dictated really by the United States, although it was presented as an arrangement with the UK, and the institutions that resulted from it were the institutions that were to control the world economy for the only undamaged nation to emerge from World War II, that is, the United States. Chomsky, who is our mentor for this program, has said that the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s, that is, the breakdown of the system that included the IMF and the World Bank in the Nixon administration, that may have been the major international event since 1945, much more significant in its implications than the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Chomsky made that comment a couple of years ago, but it seems as in the wake of the financial crisis, the truth of the point seems very clear. From roughly 1950 until the early 1970s, there was a period of unprecedented economic growth and egalitarian economic growth, not only in the United States, but in the world at large. So the lowest quintile, the lowest 20%, did as well, in some cases almost better, than the highest quintile. That is in terms of their percentage accumulation of wealth. It was also a period of some limited but real form of benefits for the population as a whole, and in fact, social indicators, measurements of the health of society, very closely tracked growth. That is, the more growth, the more those benefits, everything from infant mortality to longevity, were parallel with those growth figures. As growth went up, social indicators went up, naturally. Many economists called it the golden age of modern capitalism. That is, from World War II to the 1970s. Chomsky points out they should, of course, call it state capitalism because it was never the sort of ideal capitalism existing in a free market environment. It was always capitalism carefully guided by governments, most notably the government of the United States. By the mid-1970s, though, all that changed. Bretton Woods restrictions, that is, the restrictions that set up by the United States and the world economy at the end of the war, those restrictions on finance were dismantled by financial interests, primarily in the United States, with a desire to make more money. Finance was freed, that is, freed of government regulation. Speculation boomed. Huge amounts of capital started going into speculation against currencies and other paper manipulations. That's how George Soros made his money, for example. And the entire economy became financialized. the power of the economy shifted to the financial institutions. This is from the 1970s on, away from manufacturing. And since then, the majority of the population in the U.S. has had a tough time. In fact, it may be a unique period in American history. There's no other period where real wages, wages adjusted for inflation, have more or less stagnated for so long for a majority of the population, and where living standards have stagnated or declined. Wages in the United States for the overwhelming majority of the population are just about where they were in 1973. I mean, 40 years the 40 years has produced a stasis in wages, prosperity in the U.S. that's literally unprecedented in the American economy. If you look at social indicators, they track growth pretty closely until 1975, and at that point they start to decline, so much so that now we're pretty much back to the level of 1960. There was growth in the American economy over the last 40 years, but was highly inegalitarian. It went into a very small number of pockets, and that was just accelerated, by the way, after the recent financial crisis. There have been brief periods in which this shifted, a couple of years here and there, such as some of the 1990s, but on the whole, this has been the development or the direction in which the entire system has moved. Financial crises have increased during this period. Once financial markets were fired up, there was expected to be an increase in financial crises, and that's exactly what happened. The crisis happened to be exploding in the rich countries, so people are talking about it, but it's been happening regularly around the world, some of them very serious, and not only are they increasing in frequency, but they're getting deeper, and it's been predicted and discussed, and there are good reasons for it. So what we have here is the anniversary of the founding of the system that produced the golden age of capitalism in the 1950s and the destruction of that system in the 1970s, 40 years of what is been called generally neoliberalism that has produced misery and a lack of growth for the overwhelming majority of the American population and even more for the world population as a whole. Austerity is not something simply discovered within the last year or two. It is a result of the direct economic activities of American-led capitalism since the 1970s. So you're watching News from Neptune, the third day edition, and we will begin with our resident hat man here and an account of his week's reading.
Yes, well, I wanted to ask my colleagues here some questions about significant events of the last year. This is the day in which we say, out with the old, in with the new, and we're going to face up to the impending 2014 and maybe make some resolutions. I always resolve to be a 20% better person next year than last year.
20%? Why
yeah.
20%?
But never seems to work out anyway. So.
That means you would more than double every 5 years. That'd be pretty darn good by now.
Right. And if it can't continue, it won't. Okay. The right-wing media has discovered what's wrong with America. We have too many people who are lacking backbone, standing up to the terrorists and so on. The problem of wussification. So does everyone know what a wuss is? Apparently it's a
I think it's pronounced wuss.
Wussification, okay. Combination of a wimp and a pussy. So let's see if we can...
You're a real riot, Ron.
Yeah, right. We can man up here and show the world you've got a pair, okay? Significant events as chosen from by the PBS NewsHour, and we'll see what you think. Is this one of the most significant events of 2013? The election of Pope Francis, getting a lot of publicity anyway.
Yeah.
Revelations by the whistleblower Edward Snowden. So a lot of discussion about which one deserves to be the man of the year.
Good heavens.
The opening to Iran after the election of President Rouhani. Was that pretty significant or not? What do you think?
I think so.
Yeah. The military coup against President Morsi of Egypt. Strange lack of resistance to that on the part of the USA. Syrian refugees exceed 2 million. Enormous movement of refugees there in the Middle East. The typhoon that pummeled the Philippines, and the passing of Nelson Mandela. They also include one thing, here's very strange, the arrival of baby George to the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. What is that doing on the list? Yeah. I have no idea. But anyway, as we wave goodbye to 2013, I think we should acknowledge some of the more entertaining acts of our politicians and some other public figures. Just choosing at random here. These are the Golden Dukes awarded by Talking Points Memo. Mayor Rob Ford of Toronto for putting politics on the American map in the best possible way. Bob Filner, mayor of San Diego, for claiming that he was subject to a lynch mob, even though in all likelihood there are fewer women he encountered in his political career who weren't sexually harassed than women who were. So I could go on and on here. Paula Deen, who was brought down by nostalgia for an earlier South that went beyond butter and molasses and included the casual use of the N-word, and an African-American waitstaff dressed up for plantation-style weddings. Paula. There's another note on her in here somewhere. Oh, she was explaining to everyone that the N-word could not be said in a mean way. And, well, good for you, Paula. Other politicians, William Blakely, for inspiring the following headline. Quote, former Tennessee lawmaker allegedly drove 90 miles an hour while masturbating out the window. He was the vice mayor of Mount Carmel, Indiana. Okay. I'll play off that.
Some things I think maybe you should keep under your hat.
Okay. Well, there are many more, and if you looking for a laugh, place to find it. Anyway.
I noticed that the poet Nikki Giovanni was interviewed by Amy Goodman, I guess, last week. And she brazenly used the word balls, or lack thereof, to describe American politicians.
Right. Okay.
So if she can say it, then.
Right, yeah. There's a whole bunch of words in the gray area there, but at the risk of being bleeped out, I won't use them. On Newsmax, right-wing news site, ex-NSA National Security Agency director to Newsmax, the intel guys must man up to Obama. And Michael Hayden told Newsmax on Wednesday that the White House intelligence officials will have to man up and tell President Barack Obama which recommendations from a presidential advisory panel on the agency's surveillance activities could jeopardize national security. So they're supposed to tell Obama or show Obama that they have a pair. The intel guys are going to have to man up and say, I know that will make you feel good, Mr. President, to talk about transparency or oversight, but Mr. President, that is going to hurt our effectiveness in a significant way. The intel guys just have to man up and make those points, the retired Air Force general reiterated. Then the president has to make the right decision. Hayden, also a former CIA chief, directed the National Security Agency from 1999 to 2005. So he can't implement all of those suggested changes in the surveillance system used by NSA, which we've discovered that means that Big Uncle is watching you, Big Uncle Sam, that is.
Guess Obama hasn't killed enough kids to keep Mr. Hayden happy, huh?
Yeah. So, other news from the far right on Newsmax. Again, the Wall Street Advisor, get guns and ammo for the collapse. More and more talk about the decline of the empire, and more predictions of financial collapse and chaos from some of their favorite pundits. Financial advisor and Ford's contributor David John Murata says that while he does not think the end of the world is nigh, he does believe that many of his clients have legitimate fears about an impending financial and social disaster. Quoting, I, along with many other economists, agree with many of the concerns expressed in dire warnings. The growing debt and deficit spending is a tax on those who holding dollars. The devaluation of the U.S. dollar risks the dollar status as the reserve currency of the world, Murata warned, reports the Washington Examiner. Obamacare was the worst legislation in the past 75 years. Socialism is on the rise, and the NSA really is abrogating vast portions of the Constitution. I don't disagree with their concerns. So he advocated that those who are anticipating a financial and social breakdown advise storing food, water, and firearms. So do you have your guns and ammo in order? For
the Homeland Security does. I thought they were taking care of that for us.
Yeah. So there are an amazing number of preppers out there, they're called, preparing for the apocalypse, apparently. If you start looking for them, you might be surprised how many of them there are out
You'll
there.
be sorry, Ron, when you don't have any canned food in your basement.
Yeah, right.
I'm not sure I'm sharing mine.
Oh, remember the old debate about whether you should have a gun in your fallout shelter?
Whether you let your neighbor in or not.
Right.
Yeah, these are not new arguments in that sense. That's a good point.
Right. So, again, more and more warnings on the horizon. Even in the local paper, occasionally things will show up that are kind of eye-opening. Economy stuttering, so why are profits soaring? Cutbacks and cash hoarding are part of the answer. So even the most cautious and complacent media are actually telling us about some of this stuff. Another headline, gap between the richest and the rest worries experts. There are more and more economists telling us that a major impediment to economic growth was the sheer inequality of the richest and Americans and the rest of us. And a lot of people who don't want to hear that message and will try to deny it. But anyway, there it is. More and more people, George Packer's recent book, for example, what's it called? Unraveling or Unwinding, I guess it's called, about the social effects of this. So we're becoming more and more an unequal society. We are more and more cynical. We don't trust each other. And it's a matter of, for everyone, what's in it for me? And no society can sustain itself for very long, I'm convinced, on that basis. But there's still some people who have apparently a blind and simple faith that the invisible hand will operate somehow, and if everyone is trying to grab whatever they can for themselves, that will somehow work out to the advantage of many. And that is so crazy that I don't know what to say about it, but anyway, there it is. Finally, one of the biggest moral frauds of the year, Elie Wiesel urges tougher sanctions against Iran in a full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel is challenging the Obama administration's strategy on Iran, pushing for stronger sanctions and demanding Tehran not be allowed to have any nuclear capabilities.
Wonderful.
So be interesting to hear from some people who think that he's not an enormous fraud. In the ad, Weasel calls for the U.S. Senate to vote to toughen sanctions against Iran. So he's among the people who are, objectively speaking, as they say, the biggest warmongers in the country now. So
I think in order to actually discredit himself in this country, Weasel will have to do what the Tennessee politician you alleged having done before.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to note that in Israel he isn't taken seriously. In Israel, for whatever reason, he's seen as a kind of a clown, and that's I mean, because I think in Israel there's in some ways a better understanding of how the Holocaust is exploited in American culture.
Yeah.
They can see us sort of better than they can see themselves, of course.
After Elie Wiesel, Barack Obama, and Henry Kissinger, how can anyone take the Nobel Peace Prize seriously? I mean, it's almost counter to what it suggests to be. If someone gets that prize, you know you're in the presence of a major international criminal. I mean, that's quite remarkable. David, you got other comments on this Michigas from Ron tonight?
Well, just thank Ron for this stroll down memory lane, reminding us of the high and low, well, mostly low points.
Mostly low, right?
Of the last year, and I mean, inequality is the question. Understanding where inequality comes from leads to many questions and many answers that tell us a lot about our world. So, the first problem is to define what it is, what its sources are, where it actually does come from, what it means, how it affects people, and then to do something, analyzing it properly to do something about it.
And this headline that you quoted, experts concerned about rising inequality, sort of had a flash on a biblical parallel. Noah concerned about rising water. I mean, it sort of suggests that A, it's obvious, and B, it's serious. So,
Yeah, well, some people will go on to talk about these historical impersonal forces that are pushing us around and producing this situation. And of course, that's another hoax. All of these are the results of policy decisions which could have been made otherwise.
Well, it's an important point. But to understand how policy decisions contribute to or constitute historical impersonal forces is worthwhile. I mean, individualist heresies here probably are to be avoided. I think it was George Orwell who said, we, all of us, actually assume that the world will remain more or less the same, the outward world will remain more or less the same, but we're free to change ourselves at any moment. He says probably just the opposite is true. And I think that's one case where Orwell was right. He wasn't always right, but I think he may have got that much right.
We're always told that Americans, we're told that polls say, or that people say, that Americans want a society in which they too can get rich, in which they too can hit the jackpot, win the lottery, either literally or metaphorically. And I've always wondered what Americans, and that Americans are willing to accept a lot of inequality on the basis of that, well, I may be a loser now, but I may be a winner, or my children or grandchildren may win in the future, and I don't want to deprive them of that opportunity. And I've always wondered where there was any really decent polling that asks the right questions and gets at what people really feel about that, because I think in most of these cases, we find that Americans aren't as stupid as all that.
I think that's
well,
true.
This would lead to a discussion of what's called false consciousness. And yeah, there's the old joke about many Americans viewing themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right?
Yeah, and the fact that this isn't just sort of an accidental characteristic of Americans, that this is a result of the most propagandized people in history, that these things have been insisted upon in a way that they have not even in any other society that ever existed. The production of that mindset production of that set of assumptions is no accident. And it really begins, as you've pointed out before, Ron, at the beginning of the 20th century when basically the American ruling class decided it could not finally control a popular government by the knout and the prison cell, that it had to find some other way to do it, and the way to do it was advertising, and that the one cultural contribution of the American 20th century to the world was the advertising system. It's the brilliance, I think, of the television show Mad Men. You're going to see the cultural artifact that was indeed most important for the mid-20th century, and make poetry out of it. The poets often do get there first, and I think that's a case of their having done so. But it's a situation that's, if not unique to America, because we've spread it abroad, at least it's homegrown in America, this sort of construction of the mass mind. The Russian connection makes us think about the fact in the last generation of the Soviet Union, the samizdat publications, the underground newspapers, as they call, they weren't very much underground. They were just mimeographed and distributed popularly rather than by major news corporations, which were under the control of the government. That had a much wider reach in Russia than anything similar ever did in the West. The reason being is that the Russian population as a whole knew that their news was controlled. They knew that they didn't have a free press, and therefore when the possibility of one occurred, they were very interested in it. In America, most Americans believe, oh yes, we have a free press in America, and therefore the news is probably out there in some ways, and what I'm getting, including the things that you started the program with tonight, that's a pretty good sample of what a free press would do. And that may be the biggest and most effective lie in contemporary American culture.
What about this thesis, if that was really a new thing in history, beginning at the 20th century, the rise of the mass media in producing wars with Spain and 1898 and all that, and then radio in the early 20s and so on, and we've developed a mass society, and it seems to me we've become the most propaganda-saturated people in the history of the world. But I can't prove that.
I think, well, it certainly rings true, and the centrality of the Wilson administration and the agitation for the First World War in that transition you described seems to me to be very important. Once again, the poets have got there first. One of the few good accounts of that in a recent American historical writing was Gore Vidal's novel, what's the one about the Spanish-American War in the newspaper? In any case, yeah. And I think you're quite right. That is indeed what happened. You're watching News from Neptune, our year-end and, with hope, year-beginning edition. We'll go to David Green.
Thanks. I'm having trouble getting the Jewish this New Year confused with the Jewish New Year because I seem to want to atone instead of resolving, as we do in the secular culture. I've actually been. You mentioned Mad Men, and I've been reading about the Korean War, and I've been wondering a little bit about the possible significance of the main character in Mad Men, Don Draper, being a veteran of that war, and having acquired his new identity in the context of that war. Of taking the name of a dead soldier and starting a new life. But I can't really unravel that now. I don't know where to go with that. But it just occurred to me as I've been reading more about the Korean War, which I haven't really known as much about as I should have. That what the poets might be getting at in the context of that program. But a couple of mea culpas, or to put it, less dramatically, just corrections from the past year. I wrote an article in August about the Korean War that it was in the News Gazette, countering some of the propaganda that was circulating about the 60th, on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the war. And looking back, I think what I said was basically right, and reading up a little more on it from people like Bruce Cummings, I definitely think that I was right. One thing I was wrong about in that column that I just wanted to correct for whatever it's worth is that I asserted the notion that that General MacArthur had been fired by Truman partly because MacArthur had been gung-ho for dropping a nuclear weapon, for possibly dropping a nuclear weapon during that war on North Korea. And actually that turns out not to be the case. I'm not sure. It's a more complicated story, but apparently, according to Bruce Cummings, the authoritative historian of the war, is that it might have been the exact opposite, is that MacArthur might have been gotten out of the way in order to make it more possible for Truman to order the dropping of an A-bomb or worse at that time. But I'm not quite sure what the bottom line is. But that was a careless mistake on my part. Although I did read it somewhere that Truman had opposed MacArthur's proposals to do that. The story appears to be a much more complicated one. And while I'm mentioning that, I'm just gonna, while we're on this particular topic, I just want to say that I've been reading this book, wait a minute, how do I do this? The Korean War by Bruce Cummings. It's a kind of, I would say, popularized version of the more scholarly writing he's done on the topic, little over 200 pages, and quite a compelling, informative, and creative historical view of Korea, its role in our history, its role in world history, its role in our culture in that crucial post-war period during the Truman administration from 1945 to 1953. And because it's new to me in a lot of ways, I'm just sort of, there isn't that much I read now that changes my whole view of things, but this has changed or really added to, really embellished my view of this period of time, and I think he does a wonderful job in many ways. He talks about this book in a couple of interviews that you can watch on YouTube with a man, a regular interview program that's conducted from something called the Massachusetts College of Law by a guy named Lawrence Velvel, who has interviewed him for 2 hours in regard to this book in a very well done and well produced couple of hours, albeit interrupted by advertisements for the Massachusetts College of Law. So you can kind of fast forward through those as you could watch them on YouTube. The other kind of mea culpa that I have is from a comment I made a couple of weeks ago or a month ago on this program, in our program about Noam Chomsky. I talked about about his opposition to the Israeli boycott, to the boycott movement, in particularly to the academic boycott movement. And we've had a brouhaha in the last month or so, as the American Studies Association has supported a boycott of Israel, and I kind of wanted to fine-tune after thinking about this, finding about what this boycott is about, and then there was a debate on Democracy Now! That included our local scholar Carrie Nelson in opposition to this boycott. I want to make it clear that I'm in favor of this ASA boycott because it's an institutional boycott. I oppose institutional relations between American universities and Israeli universities, which are inevitably serve a kind of propaganda function, even if they're about science.
Okay, what does it mean as an institutional boycott, though, David? What will be the effect of the boycott for the ASA or other academic organizations? What are they asking people to do?
From what I understand is what they're asking university programs and administrations not to do is to to work up these contractual agreements with, for example, Ben Gurion University, whether based on science or exchange programs of some kind. They're not asking for they're not asking for Israeli scholars to be disinvited from this country as in individuals. So there is a distinction being made there. And I have written, in relation to our local Israel Studies program here, and the relationships that were established as a part of Governor Pat Quinn's visits to Israel around, in joint ventures in environmental research and so forth. I have opposed those because they are a part of a propaganda, a kind of they are part of a political program, which I think is inappropriate in terms of the manner in which Israel conducts its affairs in relation to the Palestinians. I mean, I think it's fair if one simply argues that we should boycott Israel because Israel treats Palestinian scholars badly, which it does. Then we're just saying, two wrongs make a right. But I think that it's these institutional collaborations that the ASA is focusing on, as far as I understand it. And I think I can support that. I would be interested to know what Chomsky would have to say about that. But some of these institutional collaborations, such as what Cornell has with Technion in Israel, establishing this new campus in Manhattan or in New York City, again, are the kind of things that can be opposed, which aren't really. It's opposing this. I mean, you call it a boycott. Maybe boycott isn't even the right word to be using for that.
Suppose Brazil decided to a group of Brazilian scholars, Brazilian academics, decided to institute exactly a parallel boycott of American universities on the basis of American crimes, either against indigenous people or the crimes around the world. There are plenty of crimes that one might point to there, or up to and including the fact that Brazilians are upset about American spying revealed by Snowden. If the Brazilian scholars did that and set up a parallel academic boycott, would that mean that a Brazilian scholar shouldn't deal with MIT professor Noam Chomsky because of, what would be the limit? It's not clear to me, even after the program the other day and reading what the ASA has actually written about their resolution, what this means. What about my counterexample?
Yeah, it's a little bit, well, maybe Brazil should boycott. I mean, what Noam Chomsky said, to get back to why I agree with Noam Chomsky in a general sense, is that his comment would be, when people say that we shouldn't invite Israeli dance troops to this country, we should say, why don't we boycott our own dance troops? We're the ones wreaking havoc around the world. And I think that he kind of makes mincemeat of that sort of thing. I mean, if people want to invite people to this country, people can choose to not go. They can choose to point out what's wrong with these people. They can choose, if it's a speaker speaking about politics, or they can choose to attend and challenge what the speaker is saying. Again, Chomsky is supporting a high bar for any violation of anything that could be called a violation of free speech. I'm not sure if academic agreements, these kind of joint agreements which the ASA promotes, fall under that in quite the same way. They claim, the leaders of this boycott, in defending this boycott, claim that it's not violating anyone's right to free speech. I tend to be convinced by that at this time. I realize there's an enormous amount of political pressure among the pro-Palestinian movement to go along with this boycott, to go along with the BDS movement in general, and to sort of as a part of the sort of movement towards a one state rather than a two-state solution. These things tend to be joined together and lumped together.
That's
and
a good
there tends
point.
to be an enormous amount of pressure, and I resist that to a certain extent. But I'm in this case, I'm trying to at least acknowledge if it's bounded in this way. I'm acknowledging that it may be viable, and it has to do with what I have opposed the fact that on this campus they established an Israel Studies program to invite Israeli scholars, which turned out to be only Jewish scholars, to speak on this campus. I consider that to be racist. I wrote that at the time. I published it in the local newspaper and on the website Electronic Intifada. So if they're talking, they're talking about something broader than this, and which would also involve scientific and technological programs. I just can't get by the propaganda value of these and the way they're exploited by people like Pat Quinn and former Chancellor Richard Herman and so forth, and how inconsistent that is with the relationships that our departments, say on this campus, have to do with programs in any other country.
One more point on this. I know Ron wants to get at this too, but let me raise the name of Norman Finkelstein, who has been quite critical of the BDS movement. You talked about the connection of the BDS movement and the one-state solution. Solution is an odd noun there. The one-state program. Finkelstein has gone so far as to call the BDS movement a cult dedicated to the destruction of Israel. That's not an unfair summary of his view, right?
Yes, he has said that, because he's been under enormous pressure to support this one state solution, and so forth, and he sort of diminishes the actual accomplishments of the BDS movement. He doesn't think it's accomplished all that much. I tend towards agreeing with his point of view in general and on this, and I tend to resist, like I say, this kind of sort of a political peer pressure, really, within the pro-Palestinian movement. He may be being a little bit harsh with the BDS movement. And I think there's a little bitterness there because of the way he's been treated by, he himself has been sort of disinvited around the country. He used to be invited to speak by the local
Which
chapters.
country?
This country.
This country, because he wasn't even let in the other country under consideration, right? Yeah.
But whereas he used to be invited a lot by the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters around the country, he no longer is because of this divide. So internal pro-Palestinian politics is getting difficult, but in general in that context, so much progress, so much more enlightenment and consciousness is being raised, and I can't say that I have to say that the BDS movement has gone along with that, has been a part of that. So it's complicated.
You got a point? You got a take on this, Ron?
Well, not everyone may know what BDS stands for,
boycott,
and your
sanction,
previous critique of this. What is it? Boycott, divestment,
sanctions.
And sanctions, right.
And I don't know where it ever got. I don't know what sanctions really have to do with it.
Part of the original program of the BDS movement was sanctions against Israel, sanctions on parallel to the sanctions against Iraq, Iran, and so forth, on the grounds of the policies that the State of Israel was following, and the sanctions were to convince them to do otherwise.
Yeah, the other consideration is the counter-argument that always comes up. The degree of interaction, of entanglement with them will help cool them off, and Israel is plainly the most aggressive and expansionist state in the Middle East. But can we tone that down a bit by developing all of these interrelationships with them?
And by talking to professors?
And what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what I want to do, I don't know if this is answering or avoiding your question, but I just want to say that, I mean, when the focus becomes on how we treat Israel, then the focus is less on how we treat our own government. And again, the major point that I agree with in terms of the Chomsky-Finkelstein approach, as opposed to a lot of aspects of the pro-Palestinian movement, is as if our government, and again, this whole argument about the Israel lobby and how much influence it really has, is that it's our own government that Americans need to deal with our own government.
Here.
Bottom line. It's our own government. Whatever happens with the Palestinians, there are some practical things that could be done to raise consciousness and sort of help Israelis understand what the cost of their doing what they're doing is, or provide some cost to that.
What the price tag is?
That's with the price tag. That refers to the so-called price tag attacks of settlers in the West Bank. But still, it's the question. Still, the bottom line has to be what our own policy is.
Yes, exactly.
And all this other stuff really is less important, much less important than any of that.
We have a few minutes left. There are a lot of things on my list here for our end of the year show. I wanted to talk about the Pope, for example, which Ron led off with, but I think I'm going to postpone the Pope for a week, and he'll understand. He's an understanding sort of guy, and that's indeed part of the story. But I want to talk about the American national religion, as opposed to the Church of Rome. And I'm prompted to do this by David's invocation of the Korean War and the circumstances of the 1950s for understanding American politics and society more than a half century later. And I will tell you that this grew out of the fact that my wife sat me down and said, "Oh, you've got to watch this movie. It's one of my favorites from being a kid." The movie was made in 1954 by the same man who made one of the greatest movies of all time, Humphrey Bogart's Casablanca. But in 1954, Michael Curtis took on a project to make a movie entitled White Christmas, starring Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye. It was supposed to be Fred Astaire, but the movie produced a perennial classic, as they say, a movie of American Christmas time, American entertainers. It's a terribly self-referential movie. Broadway dancers get together to stage a show in a Vermont lodge in order to save the fortunes of their former military commander in the war. In fact, it's a military picture of the First Order. The opening scene is set in a battleground in 1944, where the two principals, Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye, become friends, and the story begins. The story ends with their rescuing their retired commander, the general who is now the proprietor of this Vermont Inn. And I sat there, I think probably with my mouth open, watching this thing, astonished at what it revealed about American militarism of the 1950s. And remember, this was directed by the man who made one of the most interesting World War II pictures, once again with peculiar politics in some ways, but still in all much more au courant with the politics of the 1940s than this film in the 1950s. And I swear the political subtext kept obtruding. It was an amazing piece, and I couldn't help but see the retired general as being, and as I say, David set me off on this, as being Douglas MacArthur. That for a movie made in 1954, I'm just old enough to have watched the return of Douglas MacArthur to Washington after he was removed from his command by Truman. My parents sat me down and said, "You got to listen to this guy because he's a great general." I was astonished then, and more astonished the other night as I watched this 60-year-old movie. The militarization of America in the 50s is not to be believed. I think an American from 50 years earlier who was transformed to that would see that as as an amazing transformation of American society from the first years of the 20th century. The rest of the political and indeed social subtext of the movie is amazing, and it says a lot, it seems to me, about the sort of propagandized society that we've been talking about this evening. The movie is White Christmas, and it's a plea for American hegemony from the midst of the golden age of capitalism. Astonishing. I thought it was just a song.
What Bruce Cummings says in this book is that when Kim Il-sung decided, the leader of North Korea, that had been partitioned by Dean Acheson, or by one of the American leaders after World War II, when Kim Il-sung decided to invade South Korea in June of 1950, it was a godsend. That's not the word he uses, but it was a favor to to American leaders who were struggling with how to justify a military-driven economy. They were struggling how to create full employment subsequent to World War II without the kind of military production that had gone on during World War II. This gave them the pretense and the structure for military Keynesianism, and it went from there. And he talk about my childhood in Southern California. He describes the incredible influence that the defense, quote unquote, defense industry had, especially in Southern California during this time. And this is the environment. These were the people on my block. These were the people doing the jobs on my block in post-war, not my own father, but in other families, doing this kind of work, and it dominated the economy in an unbelievable way. I read figures in this book that I certainly understood how important it was, but from the figures in this book, it was extremely important.
Take on this, Ron?
Have you noticed that we're going back into Iraq? And there's always something somewhere that requires our intervention. We're going to be shipping them arms and so on.
Well,
yeah. The thing I noticed about these,
yes.
about these movies of the 40s and 50s, there may be trouble caused by a boss or a commander or somewhere higher up in the hierarchy, and there's a crisis of conscience then of the central character, and what saves the day is always appealing to someone even higher up in the hierarchy who is a more benign figure and will straighten out the mess.
You mean like God?
Well, no. If the company commander, the captain, is causing trouble, pain and misery in the lower troops, the way you ultimately resolve that is by appealing to the general, or if it's the general who's causing the problem, you appeal to the Secretary of the Army or the President or something, who will come in as the savior and fix things up. So there's always a higher level of authority for you to appeal to, and who will straighten things out.
It reminds me of that Phil Oakes song where he talks, or not song, but this kind of rant Phil Oakes does before a song when he talks about this movie about where he plays Lyndon Johnson and Lyndon Johnson plays God. Or John Wayne plays Lyndon Johnson and Lyndon Johnson plays God.
Right. Yeah, he's played Bobby Dylan, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Ron started this evening's program with a list of things from the right-wing press, and in order to counter the supposition, which I'm not sure is Ron's supposition at all, the supposition that some people carry away that the right-wing press, of course, is an embarrassment, but thank goodness we have mainstream media to tell us the straight story all the time. I know Ron doesn't believe that, but I have some examples from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. On NBC's Meet the Press, Time reporter Mark Halperin, who's just written a big book about the last election, had this to say about New Jersey's Republican governor. Quote, Chris Christie is someone who is magical in the way politicians can be magical, like our last three presidents, close quote. That's NBC, Meet the Press. This isn't the right-wing media now. The January 23rd of the PBS series, this is public television now, but PBS series Nova was a mostly upbeat report on drones and surveillance. What viewers may not have known about Rise of the Drones, as the program was called, was funded by Lockheed Martin, the giant aerospace corporation that just happens to be a major drone manufacturer. When it appeared that the U.S. would carry out a military attack on Syria, some CNN reporters stepped right into Pentagon PR mode. Anchor Brooke Baldwin declared that U.S. warships, quote, can carry cruise missiles able to strike targets more than 1,000 miles away with pinpoint accuracy, close quote. This is CNN now. A few days later, CNN correspondent Tom Foreman told viewers, quote, cruise missiles are extraordinary weapons. They're very reliable. They have pinpoint accuracy, close quote. So CNN was reassuring us on that point. The Washington Post columnist Richard Cohen, I'm going to skip that. That's too long a story. When former conservative British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher died in April, pundits lined up to pay tribute, American pundits. The Washington Post David Ignatius wrote that he saw Thatcher, quote, take down the British class system. Good heavens. Now, one knows about peculiar notions at the Washington Post, but lordy, I didn't think they'd departed from reality entirely. This is David Ignatius again in the Washington Post. He cheered that the upper classes became porous. Well, and life became a Ralph Lauren ad. What the hell does that mean? This was praising Thatcher for destroying the British class system, the very thing, of course, that she reinforced. The New York Times' John Burns, who's even worse, recalled, quote, the Britain I grew up in the wake of the Second World War, was a country that was in precipitous decline, which had entirely lost its national self-confidence. What it did was introduce the greatest social reforms in more than a century in the years after the Second World War, much more than the United States did while the U.S. was putting together the IMF. But, according to John Burns, it was all falling apart, and, quote, Mrs. Thatcher put that right, close quote. This guy was covering, Britain for the New York Times at the time. There's more. On the PBS NewsHour, David Brooks, we mentioned David already tonight, thought Barack Obama's proposal to cut Social Security was, quote, brave and a move to the center, close quote. The PBS version of the left, Mark Shields, thought it was, quote, gutsy. He should get credit for doing something bold and difficult, close quote. That's left and right as understood by PBS.
Right. Yeah, real ballsy guy.
That's right. Sure. MSNBC's Joe Scarborough marked the 10th anniversary of this is MSNBC, marked the 10th anniversary of the Iraq invasion by heaping scorn on media outlets like the New York Times that failed to acknowledge their responsibility for leading the country into war. The quote, the very same people who spent years beating up George Bush were the very ones beating the drum for Iraq's regime change and Saddam Hussein's ouster, close quote. But 10 years earlier, Scarborough had criticized the media for not being pro-war enough. I doubt that the journalists, quote, I doubt that the journalists at the New York Times and NPR and ABC and CNN are going to ever admit just how wrong their negative pronouncements have been over the last 4 weeks. That was 2003 when the invasion of Iraq took place. The next day, he declared, I'm waiting to hear the words I was wrong from some of the world's most elite journalists, politicians, and Hollywood types. Their wartime predictions were arrogant, they were misguided, and they were dead wrong. Maybe, just maybe, these self-anointed critics will learn from their mistakes, close quote. That's MSNBC, on the success of George Bush's invasion of Iraq. There's more. Fareed Zakaria probably shouldn't get away. Dedicated a portion of his October 13th CNN show to a discussion of income equality and the second anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. But he didn't bring any Occupy activists or advocates for the poor to discussion. Instead, he talked to three guests, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, the CEO of Duke Energy, and the CEO of Digicel, another defense contractor, as they say. It goes on and on. This is the way news is done in this country and the ways that we try not to do it here at News from Neptune. Closing comments, gentlemen?
What do you look forward to in 2014?
Still being around to complain, at least. Yeah. Oh, yes.
We'll take that up next. How about if we take that up in 2014?
I think we should.
Sure.
You have been watching News from Neptune for the last week of 2013, the third day edition. If our program interested you, you may want to look for similar programs here at Urbana Public Television now, not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. And thanks to Caleb on YouTube. We are on YouTube frequently. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Ron Szoke and David Green. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come endures in my discharge. In the meantime, Confusion are enemies, and a good night to you.